Hi guys, welcome back to Chess the Matthew. So on this video, we will tackle about an instructive game from the Damiano defense, in which it starts with the moves of e4, e5, knight f3, f6, and on this video, we shall see the example game of Robert James Fischer versus Robert McGregor on the simultaneous exhibition, in which here McGregor is black and he plays f6, the Damiano defense, against Bobby Fischer as white, for example, on this position. And here, Bobby Fischer here plays knight takes e5, and McGregor here just played the move queen to e7, the best line against the aggressive knight takes e5 of white here on the Damiano's defense. So, for example, if the white here insists, for example, with queen to h5, the idea is, for example, after giving a check to the black's camp, and if the black here defend with g6 to cover the check, and there is a nice trick, for example, for white after knight takes g6, because after h takes g6, the black here will lose a rook on a8. But going back, for example, after knight takes g6, the best move here against that tricky move for the white is to have, for example, a queen takes to e4, giving a check, a fork to the king and to the knight, for example, on g6. And for example, if the white here defend with bishop to e2 to cover the check, but the black here wins a piece on the g6 with an extra knight on the board. So going back, for example, after queen to e7, Bobby Fischer here cannot actually play queen h5 because he will lose immediately a piece on this position. So after queen e7, a main line for the black, Bobby Fischer here retreat his knight to f3, and again McGregor here plays d5, our main line for the Damiano defense, and Bobby Fischer here defend his pawn with d3, but after d takes e4, d takes e4, and queen takes e4, and we shall see in this position now that McGregor here easily recover his pawn deposit on this position with a check. And after, for example, Bobby Fischer here cover a check with bishop to e2, although McGregor here plays bishop f5, in which it is not actually a main move on this position, rather than to play knight c6, for example, our main line on the Damiano defense, as what I actually show you from my last video. And for example, knight c3 attacking our queen, but we have bishop b4 pinning the knight against the king, for example, so that this knight cannot capture our queen because there is an open check. And for example, if the white here actually castle, but there is simple bishop takes c3, and after b takes c3, bishop d7, and after rook to e1, again the black here can timely castle on the queen side and to avoid any skewer technique on this position with rook e1, and leaving to the white's position with double c pawn on the board. So going that, for example, after bishop to e2, in which although McGregor here plays a sideline move after bishop to f5, but after, for example, knight d4, knight c6, knight takes f5, queen takes f5, kingside castling, and bishop d6, still McGregor here can actually find his king safety on the king side because he actually now covered the open d file against the white queen on d1. So for example, after bishop to g4, in which it actually attacks our queen and stopping our king to find a queenside castling on the board, but still there is just a simple queen to b5. And after knight c3 attacking our queen, we had just a sidestep move against the attack of this knight. And even though, for example, Bobby Fischer here chased the queen of McGregor, but after, for example, queen f7, again the queen is on a safe square against these attacks, and later on the black here can actually find its home to the c8 square. So going back, for example, after queen to c4, even though the white here will play rook to e1 to give a check, and the black here can actually have a simple knight g to e7 covering the check from this rook. And even though the white here actually will post this bishop on the e6 attacking the queen and stopping the black king here to have a kingside castling or even to queenside castling, but there is just a simple queen to b4, and for example after a3 attacking the queen, but there's just simple queen c5, and after, for example, bishop to e3, attacking the queen and a timely developing a piece for the white, but there is just a simple queen to e5 and it attacks now the bishop on e6. And for example, after a retreat of the bishop that actually escaped from the attack of this queen, although it still stopped the black here to castle on the king side, but the white here can do a king side castling later on. For example, after queen takes h2 check, winning a pawn on its position, and after king f1 and king side castling, after the black here find its home, and later on the pawn deficit will be realized for black as an advantage in the in-game. So going back, for example, after queen to c4 on its position, in which Bobby Fischer here tries to chase the queen of the black, but after queen f7, in which the black here totally put his queen into safety on f7, and after, for example, bishop b5, trying to double the c file, but still McGregor here just castle on the queen side, because after, for example, after queen g4 of Bobby Fischer, there's just simple f5 covering the check, and after queen h3, knight g to e7, knight to e4, again attacking this bishop with his knight on e4, but there is just simple h6 stopping any knight g5 half. For example, after knight takes, rook takes, bishop f4 attacking the rook again and timely developing his piece on f4 square, and for example after rook d4 attacking the bishop, bishop e3, rook to b4 attacking the bishop again on the b5, in which it is actually undefended, and for example after bishop takes, knight takes, b3, saving his pawn, but there's just simple rook to e4, and after, for example, on this position in which Bobby Fischer here plays rook f to d1, but there is just a simple rook to d8 that leads to a draw on this position. Although the black here can find a winning chances after, for example, rook h to e8, in which, for example, after rook to d3 for white, but there is just a simple queen to f6 attacking the rook on the a1, and after, for example, after escape rook a to d1, but there's just simple rook h4 attacking the queen, and after the queen escape to f3, but there's just a simple knight e5 forking the rook and queen, and after, for example, queen moves, but knight takes d3 wins a rook for the black's perspective. And for example, going back, even though the white here tries another escape and plays queen to g3, but there's just simple f4 a fork with the pawn, and for example after queen f3, pawn takes, rook takes, rook takes, and after queen takes, we shall see in this position now that after rook to d4, the black here emerges an extra piece on the c6 square. So going back, for example, after rook fd1, even though McGregor here can place rook h to e8 and have attacking chances on the board, but rook to d1 is still good because it forces a draw on its position. For example, after rook takes d8, knight takes d8, rook to d1, and after queen to e6 and g3, McGregor here finds a tactical shot that forced the position into a draw. For example, after rook takes e3, and Bobby Fischer here agreed a draw against McGregor on 26 moves. Because, for example, if we continue on this position, if Bobby Fischer here will capture the rook, but there's just simple queen takes, and this king can not actually go on this square because he will lose a piece. For example, if he play here to king g2, there is queen to d2 and wins the rook. And for example, if king to h1, then there is a queen to f3, a fork again. For example, just for a record, after king g2 and after on this position in which the black here is winning against the white because the black here has an extra piece on d8. And for example, if Bobby Fischer here insists to play king to h1, escaping the check from this queen, but still it is the same after queen to f3. For example, for the record, after queen f3 check, even though he covered, then again the white here loses a piece and the black here is still winning with an extra knight on the d8 square. So for example, after rook takes e3, in which they actually agreed draw on this position, if we continue, for example, after f takes a3 and after queen takes a3 check, Bobby Fischer here is actually facing a perpetual check because of the fact that he cannot go to g2 and h1, and the only square he can go is on this f1. And if try to move his king to f1, but there is a queen f3 check, and if he move on this square, then he will lose his rook, so he will put his king to e1, and again they will repeat the moves because he cannot afford that he will lose a piece. Instead, to agree that the game actually ended a draw after rook takes to a3. So going back from the initial position, in which the Damiano defense is not actually a worst opening at all. For example, after e4, e5, knight f3, f6, in which McGregor here actually played the correct idea of the opening after, for example, knight takes e5 of Bobby Fischer, in which McGregor here play queen to e7 and forces a draw after knight f3, d5, d3, d takes e4, d takes e4, and queen takes e4, and bishop to e2, in which in my last video I show you that the main line here is actually knight c6, even though McGregor here plays bishop f4, a sideline moves on this opening. But for example, after d4, McGregor here actually find the best move after knight c6, knight takes f5, queen takes f5, kingside castling, and after bishop d6, in which it allows here for the black to have a queenside castling. And for example, after bishop g4, trying to prevent any queenside castling, but it's just simple queen to b5 that actually prevents to this bishop to be developed because he will lose his b2 pawn. And for example, after knight c3, queen c4, bishop to e2, and queen f7. After this position, it is actually evaluated as equal for both sides, even though the white here, for example, Bobby Fischer here insists to play a winning move after bishop to b5, but still after the black here successfully castle on the queen side, then he actually forces Bobby Fischer here to have a draw game, even though Bobby Fischer here actually continue with queen g4 check, but there's just f5, queen h3, knight g7, knight e4, h6, stopping any knight g5 hop. And for example, after some exchanges to d6 square, but still the evaluation on the board is actually a radical equal after these moves. For example, attacking the bishop, attacking the rook, attacking the bishop and pawn, and after some exchanges, b3, rook to e4, rook fd1. Although the black here can actually find another winning moves after rook h8, because for example after rook fd1 it is actually an accurate move, but still rook d8 is doing fine because it actually forces some exchanges, and after some exchanges and after this rook to d1, McGregor here find a forced draw after queen to e6, and after g3, rook takes e3. The result of the game between Bobby Fischer and McGregor here is actually a draw because of the latter variation. So they say that Damiano defense is actually a bad opening or a worst opening at all, but with a proper handling of this opening after queen to e7, it can actually forces a draw, even though your opponent here is a world champion. For example, Bobby Fischer here against McGregor, and after this position in which the white here plays bishop to e2, even though McGregor here plays a sideline moves, but a draw is a draw, and it puts a psychological win because the Damiano defense is known as a worst opening but able to draw against the great Bobby Fischer. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please don't forget to subscribe.